Have a good day. I'm glad to be here today. I'll be sharing some insights on the case study relating to the revenue planning strategy in Emirates Airline with a particular context of the pandemic. As we know, the traditional revenue planning is all about connecting dots in a meaningful way to form a pattern. It's more, so there are two components to traditional revenue planning. One is the demand side, and another one is the quality of revenue. The demand side is more of an art than exact science, whereas the quality of revenue is more of exact science. So in summary, the traditional revenue planning is a fine balance between science and art. Now, the traditional revenue planning was challenged by the pandemic over the last 1 year. It's completely upset the fundamentals of traditional revenue planning. The demand planning had changed completely in the last 1 year. That's because of a few interdependent conditions like the regulatory landscape imposed by various countries on travel restrictions and all other associated conditions. Therefore, the history-based models were rendered ineffective or completely unreliable. Now, we start to see a few new travel behaviors, and we also noticed quite a lot of differences in the customer expectations. Now, how this matters is because these are the ingredients of demand planning. And when these ingredients have started to be upset and changed completely, then the traditional revenue models have to be completely reset. So this is where, if you move on to the next slide, we're talking about the solution to how we manage the situation. Can we go to the next slide? Well, now we had a few choices. Now, we had to switch immediately to an agile mode. So we formed an agile team to be able to look into the immediate challenges associated with the pandemic. That was relating to the demand. So the custom-built tools and processes had to be invoked. So in order to do that, we had to have a very clear understanding of what was impacting the demand scenario, and we also had to understand the new trends. Now, there are a few pointers that came out when we started to look into it, and that's what I'm trying to present here in the case study. Immediately we came to a realization that the impact of the pandemic was going to be severe. We acknowledged the enormity of the situation, and that was very relevant and that was very important, because if we do not see the gravity of the situation, it's going to be extremely difficult to set out a plan and to be able to mitigate the issues associated with that. The unreliability of predictions was one of the major challenges. The industry pundits came with quite a lot of different scenarios. Now, through our experience, we found that a lot of these external analyses were rendered ineffective, or they were vastly different from what transpired. There were various demand resumption theories floating around, like a U-shaped recovery, a V-shaped recovery, a W-shaped recovery. But what we experienced over the last 1 year was completely different from what historically the demand resumption curves had dictated. So therefore, we decided fairly at the early stage of the pandemic that we had to build an internal model. We had to really understand the components of what was influencing the demand in the current context, that means in the context of the pandemic, and then start to build a predictive forecast model around that. So if you move on to the next slide, we have set out a few critical elements as part of this. One is the COVID monitoring, the monitoring of the virus itself. The reason why it was important was a lot of the demand influencing factors were influenced by the government effectiveness to control the infection. And also we have to understand clearly the various infection stages of the virus itself, because each stage of the virus had a very different demand driver and very different influence in terms of the travel behavior. So therefore, it was very important for us to understand, to be able to build a meaningful algorithm to address the issue. And we studied the propensity of the demand. Traditionally, the propensities were based on economic criteria. But in the current context, or in the new normal, we found that the propensity drivers were very different. At the early part of the pandemic, we saw that the willingness to pay was very high. So that was factored in. But at some point in time later on, that wasn't the case. People, when they started to feel more comfortable about the travel, the hygiene factor, the health factor, then the economic criteria was different. So all those parameters had to be understood and clearly set out in the algorithm. So the new segmentation, the new buying behavior, all these had to be understood very clearly. If you move on to the next slide, the critical part of it is to set a new profitability mandate. In the context of an airline industry, which is a highly capital intensive industry, very high cost, the fixed cost is a significantly higher proportion. So it starts at a very high level. So what it means is, for us to be able to cover the cash operating cost and move on to start to mitigate the fixed operating cost, we had to have a minimal level of operation to be able to cover the cash operating cost. So we took a step approach in terms of targeting the cash break even first to sustain, to start to generate cash, and to be able to then mitigate some of the sunk costs associated with a capital intensive industry. It was very important to have a micro level due diligence. It was almost like a war room approach. So every day we would sit in the morning to try and understand what happened the previous day, what was the forecast, and what was the delta between the actual and the forecast, and what constituted the change, and therefore factor that in for the immediate days and for the following week. So that's a war room approach, and we had to have this agile team. Now, what came into our rescue was the ability of our data science team, in-house team, to be able to rely on data science. We started to build a machine learning model. It's very important to understand the role technology plays in any sort of demand planning. The traditional context did not require data science or the machine learning model, but the reason why we had to adopt this is because of the iterative process that is the forecasting. So we had to continuously move forward to be able to try and understand the various changes that was happening during the different stages of the pandemic. So we set up something called an epidemiological SEER model, which addressed 4 stages of the pandemic itself: the susceptibility of the pandemic, and then the infectious stage, and the exposure, and finally the recovery stage. So each one had different demand influences, and we started to assess, build the algorithm accordingly. Initially, we had a huge difference in terms of the outcome, but as we started to finesse, as we started to build more algorithms, we were able to get to the reasonable accuracy. And we used something called a Bayesian optimization parameter calibration, which is again using the industry data tools, but using internal calibration models. So what is the learning coming out of all the case study? If you look into the next slide, these are a few key pointers. One is, it's very important for us to understand the agility that's required in responding to these business challenges, more so in the current context, which is constantly changing and very dynamic. And we had to use a predictive data modeling, the forecast modeling. Data science techniques were key, and which was helpful in providing some intuitive analysis. We set very clear economic criteria without which we will be rudderless. So it's very important to set a clear economic criteria. As I mentioned, stage 1, cash break even. Stage 2 is fully loaded cost to be covered. Finally, the recommendation is be optimistic. As a planner, we always have to be very optimistic. But that said, we got to plan for the worst, because we're being confronted by something that the industry or the world has not seen in the last 60, 70 years. So therefore, we need to have multiple scenarios, the worst case scenario, just so that if we falter in the optimistic scenario, that we have a fallback in place.